what you might have is different levels of struggle. It particularly is bad for anyone who's different, anyone who's marginalized, anyone who's a bit divergent, anyone who's neurodivergent. We need to identify why we're struggling. We need to identify what can be done about it. What is functioning versus not functioning, or good functioning, or being well, and how does it get judged, and what are our hopes for it, and what do we need to be realistic about? So yeah, I mean, if we put it in this particular type of language, it contributes to well functioning. Which I was saying we might talk a bit about the word functioning and dysfunction and functioning levels and all that stuff today, maybe, and there's nothing terribly wrong with the word functioning, in its own way, but on the other hand, it's taken on a lot of kind of connotations and baggage, I think, both in mental health in general, the world in general, but also specifically in the autistic world as well. Certainly the high functioning, low functioning levels, all of that is really, it bothers a lot of people for, I think, good reasons, So
absolutely,
it should be worth just talking about that a bit, I thought.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. And of course, as well, the other thing that occurs to me about functioning is that it can get mixed up with performance, can't it?
Oh, absolutely.
Based on their contribution to the capitalism, and what gets valued and what doesn't, and what's classed as functioning and what isn't,
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that is definitely one of the points that was on my mind as well. And I know we're both thinking a lot more along these lines these days. And we give Robert Chapman's book, Empire of Normality.
I must read that. I haven't read it yet.
No, I'll just give it another plug there, But it's in a sense, it's some familiar things, but he just puts it together very well. But he also just is, the real one of the core points he makes, I think, is just that, the way that the pressure of normality and the narrowness of systems, everything from education systems to work systems to political systems, have kind of narrowed down the tight path that people are expected to walk. That it's done very few people any good, except maybe those with a lot of power. But he's just saying that it particularly is bad for anyone who's different, anyone who's marginalized, anyone who's a bit divergent, anyone who's neurodivergent. And he thinks that one of the reasons that we've become more aware, in fact, of neurodivergence and how common it is relative to what we thought, was because of the squeeze has got tighter and tighter. And, we're neurodivergent people who maybe were struggling a bit less or struggling more, it's like it's harder and harder to be different, and to be divergent, so the fight back is starting, so to speak. We're becoming aware that, no, hold on, we can't function well. Coming back to that point, we can't function well. Please, we need something, we need help, we need to identify why we're struggling, we need to identify what can be done about it. But I thought about that bit as well before this chat, and I actually wrote a couple of notes down, and I wrote down, just from my own remembering, I wrote down, if functioning well functioning, the opposite of dysfunctioning or, poor functioning, if it means suitable for the capitalist system, then for starting, it can be applied to anyone, like, and is, unfortunately, I mean, parents to youngsters sometimes, for instance, functioning means getting to college, getting, to a permanent job, that kind of thing. But possibly it should be applied to no one, because it's not a healthy definition of, functioning well for that system is good functioning. If it means doing well in oneself, on the other hand, if it means being well, being reasonably well balanced in your health, including your mental health, if it means that you are, kind of you're living in a niche that works well for you, you have some, support and some good friends and work that you reasonably enjoy, and time and energy and, all of those things. If it means not struggling too much, then it simply, can and should be applied to everyone. There's nothing particular then about how it should be applied in a way to autistic people or any other neurodivergent minority, so that's part of, I suppose, what was in my mind in bringing it as a term. It's like, what unpack it, deconstruct it a bit, What
Yeah.
does it actually mean? Where did it come from? How are we using it? How do we want to use it? Do we want to use it at all? So yeah, like definitely that point was on my mind as well.
Yeah, sounds like a good discussion, a good
Yeah.
way in, good start.
Yeah. But like I do think that the other side of the coin then is the word dysfunction.
Yeah.
Because dysfunction is like disorder, isn't it? It's like those other words. It's like deficit. It's like those other D words. Funny how they're all D words, It's like those D words that
Yeah.
that we are just a bit fed up with in terms of certainly as autistic people, as neurodivergent people, as people with ADHD. So, attention deficit,
Yeah.
hyperactivity disorder, executive dysfunction.
Yeah. It's sort of like implying less than or not good enough, not as good as, isn't it?
Faulty,
Yeah.
broken. This computer is not functioning. It's malfunctioning. There's something wrong with it.
Yeah. 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 And who's measuring that and against what?
Exactly. And in some ways, I actually think that's possibly the core question, because the way this has emerged as a big controversy and dialogue in the world of autistic people is the notions of high functioning and low functioning, or functioning levels. The DSM uses the language of functioning levels. Level 2, level 3, requiring a lot of support, medium amount of support, a bit of support, but often that's just seen as high functioning, medium functioning, and low functioning is the way that's often talked about in clinical practice.
And people think, don't they? I've heard people thinking that what that suggests is that there are 3 different levels of autism. So a person can be much less autistic or much more autistic, depending on the level, like it's a degree of autism. And of course, it's
totally.
We're all autistic. All autistic are autistic people, and that is that, isn't it? But we may have different aspects to ourselves, like a graphic equalizer. All the constellation of human characteristics or functioning things, could be different amongst autistic people, but we are all autistic. We might have different support needs. And as well, saying that a person is a certain functioning level suggests that there's no contextualizing. These things can change over time in different situations.
Yeah, well, I think that part is a huge part, and tied in with that, I was thinking about when you were talking there was, people also are autistic, and so you could be autistic and, have epilepsy. You could be autistic and, have, grown up with massive trauma in your family. You might not have any of these mixes, but you could be autistic and ADHD or not. You could be autistic and a recent immigrant to a country, or, autistic and, living where you've always lived. And you can, so there's autistic and, the environment and the context, but there's also the intersectionality, the autistic specific other issues that also can be issues that, maybe need, support, or that, are minority identities, or, autistic and gay, and so, to simply say, there's kind of and not everybody is saying this, but as you said, a lot of people interpret it that way. So to simply think that there's, just 3 bands of being autistic, how bad you are, how autistic you are, I think, that's definitely something we need to be much more careful about and educate a lot of people around, because that's just doesn't work. Just doesn't remotely match the actual reality.
That's it. And also, it contributes as well, doesn't it, to the phenomenon of why so many autistic adults have not thought of themselves as being autistic and have not been identified as such, or not identified themselves as, because they're not as autistic as those people, so they can't be autistic. It's that kind of thing that goes on, isn't it?
It is. And, that's also a really core point that, again, I'm almost so used to that I don't quite see it, but it's vital. And that is, the whole point of the neurodiversity paradigm as distinct from the pathology or medical paradigm, is that being autistic is not a problem. There's nothing.
Yeah.
It's not a struggle by its nature.
Yes.
It can be one. But any more than being gay is a struggle and a problem, or having deciding that in fact you don't identify with the gender you were assigned at birth is a problem and brings
Or being a person of colour is not a problem.
No,
It has been a problem for a lot of people because of the way that society has framed these things and treated people and marginalised their interests and so on and their voices.
Yeah, so there can't be, by looking at it that way, which is how we see it. There can't be levels of autism, any more than there can be levels of what other kind of categories you compare that to. You simply a fact about you, that this is how you see the world, this is how you experience the world, this is
cognitive style.
That's
why we use the word neurotype, isn't it?
Because
you either are or you aren't.
Yeah, you don't have a level of neurotype. There's no such thing. And what you might have is different levels of struggle. And of course, it is interesting how the DSM specifically defines autism spectrum disorder as including a level of struggle. In other words, if you have, a lot of sensory sensitivity and a tendency to be, quite structured and loving of routine, and you find it hard to interpret some of what's going on, socioculturally around you, and you have no interest in small talk, but have no struggle around any of those, then actually you don't have autism spectrum disorder, which, it's fine, because I don't see myself as having a disorder. But all the same, under the current system, you might, if you want any kind of support, you have to fit into that model of, well, how, what's your level of struggle? Okay, then we define you as not quite functioning well. And then, yes, we might give you some help, though it can also, of course, getting a diagnosis can be very stigmatizing, and you end up losing out on whatever, promotion or something like that. So it's like there's a real double bind kind of going on around all this, I think, at this point in history. People want to identify, but they can only officially identify under the system which says they are dysfunctioning and disordered. And then, okay, you might get some help, right? But you also might get passed over for promotion or stigmatized in your workplace or otherwise.
I suppose, as you're talking, it does occur to me, though, remember that we are mature in age and that we are privileged in lots of ways, and that we've managed to organize our lives around what our needs are and our natural things that naturally suit us. A lot of it we did before we even knew we were autistic. And then we were positioned to be able to, and we have been able to, we've been able to do that. And lots of people don't have options, so they are more challenged than we might be from being able, like for me, for example, being able to work at home and things like that. Not everybody does have that option.
No, they're just coping reasonably well with the challenge. I think.
And you've arranged your life around. As have I, encountering those challenges not as often as as infrequently as possible.
I mean, at this point in history, I think that's often how an autistic person needs to achieve good, well-being, good functioning, if you want to call it that. But you see, again, the more we talk about it today, the more I think functioning is, again, one of those words from outside. Again, and autism has been seen from the outside. It's a more behavioral, visible, observable type of word. How well are you functioning? Whereas, well-being, of course,
just being,
what you're doing. It's about how you feel and how you experience your world. But yeah, some being pretty well and yes, functioning well. For the moment, at this point in history, for a lot of autistic people, that does mean, I think, building their world, their niche, their support system, their people, their tribe, a doable job. Now, as the world becomes more autistic friendly, perhaps there'll be a bit less need to do that, but that is the current thing. But the other thing I was thinking about coming to this discussion was, you know, like the big point that's often made in these discussions is, like you were touching on it there a few minutes ago, was that you know, functioning isn't a static thing, you know. Like it varies with context, it varies with time, it varies with age, it varies with circumstances. It can vary from moment to moment, you know. It can vary whether, you know, from literally if something stressful suddenly happens, you might be functioning less well, you know. It can vary from morning to evening, depending on whether you're a morning person or an afternoon person, you know. It can vary, you know, from depending whether you're sick or well with the, you know, a virus. It can vary whether you're in a new job or a job you're familiar with. It can vary in so many million ways. And, you know, I think that's worth coming back to. But also, obviously, we can then, for that very reason, try and create a life for ourselves that stabilizes that somewhat, and the ups and downs are softened out. But this is the other major point that occurred to me when I was thinking about this, was that even when autistic people are functioning well, are in a state of reasonably good well-being, are reasonably happy and, you know, stable in their lives, I think that, you know, that can be quite precarious.
Yeah.
A lot of other people's well-being. It can be much slighter than it looks, you know. Maybe it doesn't quite go as deep. It can be, you know, not, it's like how productive and satisfying is it, you know, compared to what they would like to have. So I'm not complaining bitterly about my current life now, personally, by any means. I'm pretty happy with it, you know. But I know for plenty of autistic people, and I think even for myself, you know, there's just might be that slight more bareness and precariousness and, you know, delicacy to it, I think, than there might be for somebody who fits in a little bit more easily into the broad nature of our society, and who generally always has and has really got that down pat, so to speak, you know. I think that's an important point.
Because it can vary, can't it, on as well how much stuff you've got to process of what's going on, what's impacting you. And as you say, it can feel bowed, of course. What's the word that suits me is like it's fragile, that it's not secure, you know. It can be changeable.
Yes. Yeah. I think fragile is a good word as well. It definitely can be. I think, you know, it's almost, another metaphor might be a bit less deeply rooted, you know. Like, you know, people who, even if I just make that comparison in my own mind to my experience of growing up, and my comparison, as we do, to our peers, and, you know, my comparison since then through adulthood to my peers, you know, I would have feel like that eventually I got reasonably solidly rooted, you know. But there are also people who are getting well rooted in their lives, more mainstream, if you like, less divergent, more typical lives, for a lot longer. You know, they've had longer, just like a tree that has had longer to get rooted will be more deeply rooted, you know. And I would feel, I didn't have as long to get rooted because I started a lot later getting rooted. And I agree with you. We have got reasonably rooted in a good life, but not as deeply rooted. And so, more fragile, more susceptible to the winds and the storms, possibly, than someone who's more deeply rooted, you know.
And it's, you know, when we're working with clients as well, it says that's part of the work, isn't it? When people are late identifying as autistic people, it's getting used to that and accepting the changeability. You know, that's one of the things to get your head around, I think. You know, so that you change expectations about yourself, and it doesn't, you know, instead of tutting, oh, why I could do this yesterday, why can't I do it today? That's not helpful, is it? That's a very internalized ableist kind of approach. Whereas the real me is saying, well, today I can't, or, you know, it feels like this, or I'm having this or that challenge, and that's the reality. That's me. That's who I am. Starting from there.
Yeah, and, you know, that's a question also that I've, you know, been exploring more recently. Like, you know, what is, you know, what are the kind of the limits, the outer positive limits of autistic well-being? Because we're only beginning to discover that. You know, the assumption has always been that they've been very limited, you know. how much of a good life an autistic person could have. We're moving rapidly away from that, but the people who are exploring those issues these days are mostly people who have already lost a chunk of their life to not knowing who they were, and therefore we don't really know. As they say, is there such thing as an untraumatized, unmasked autistic adult? Then we don't really know yet what it'll look like to maybe grow up with a lot of support as somebody who identifies autistic, and hopefully that's what's going down the line. And what are the sort of possible kind of things that still might be difficult, because it's just still a minority way to be, minority neurotype, minority cognitive style, and what might just fall away as a problem. I saw a phrase today in an article, a blog article on meltdowns, because I was just looking for what might be useful information to pass on to a client on this topic, and it said something useful article, but it said something like, you can learn to watch for the triggers and plan more, and try and find more support from people and explain to them what's going on, and you can de-shame it, and so on. I'm saying, but you will always have meltdowns, and I was kind of thinking, well, actually, do we know if that's true yet?
I wonder.
We just don't know. I think it's like maybe some of us will and some of us won't, and maybe some people in the future won't. Maybe there will be autistic people who never have a meltdown, perhaps.
That's what I wonder. I wonder that, because if you're properly attuned to from the very beginning, then, it seems to me that the meltdown contains a lot of frustration anyway about not again being misunderstood, not again being.
Oh, definitely. That's what came up for my clients.
Yeah. I know. Yeah.
So I mean, if there was less of that, not only in the present moment that triggers the meltdown trigger, but just in the past, less baggage that they're carrying, to use that technical term from the world of therapy, less baggage. If there's less baggage, then maybe there will be less or even no meltdown, which again comes back to this notion of like, what is functioning versus not functioning, or good functioning, or being well, and how does it get judged, and what are our hopes for it, and what do we need to be realistic about? And it is a question. Yeah.
I'm speaking to somebody recently, an autistic person, not a client, an autistic person, who was saying how they have changed their way of working, their pattern of working, so that they have 1 week off every 6 or 8 weeks or something. I mean, they're able to do that, so that that's fine. And I said, well, actually, that wouldn't work for me, to be honest with you. I get what you're doing, and great that it works for you. I can understand, but it wouldn't work for me. I can't predict that in advance. I can't make myself be relaxed on demand because it's in my timetable. So, but there is something about being able to predict or monitor and anticipate as much as possible, or certainly be aligned with, your levels of energy and impact, because we know that that's part of it, isn't it, that affects functioning.
Yeah. And I mean, as you said, that wouldn't work for you. I don't think it would work for me either, but I'm interested in it because it's individualized. Again,
that person has realized for themselves that works for them. Yeah.
Whereas again, it's that sort of normalization agenda, that Damien Milton and Robert Chapman and people like that talk about. It's like almost everybody is expected to, work 5 days a week or a bit more, and have most of the weekend or all the weekend off, take holidays, of a week or two, about 3 times a year, with some exceptions. Obviously, like teachers' holidays is an exception to that, and so on. But by and large, it's like, and of course there's loads of exceptions, but still that's the dominant sort of assumption, rather than, maybe people could just have very different styles. And I think particularly, you find quite a lot of autistic people do just have a different style. Like they for instance, they might work really long hours a few days of the week, and they can take a few days off rather than take 5 days and take 2 off, or they might, be more, be something like an artist or a craft worker or something like that, who spends a few months of the year producing lots and lots of goods, and then sells those things for another few months of the year, and then takes a few months off. And of course, lots of people just simply don't have that option because of the nature of the world of work these days. But what's interesting about it is how might an individual find what works for them? That's the really interesting thing.
Yeah, because it can be a trap, can't it? Listening to common advice, that's doled out about things like, oh, you shouldn't work, but you shouldn't be at your desk before 8 a.m. or something. Don't stay longer than 5 or 6 p.m. For me, if I've got the energy and I'm in my flow, I will do. I'll work till 9, 10 o'clock easily on the laptop. And then other days when I just know that I can't, I just think, actually, I had booked myself in to do this piece of writing or something today, and it's not going to happen. And I don't mind, because on the days when I can and want to, I will push the envelope,
Yeah, and that's kind of links for me, because I think, in the end of it all, partly where our discussion is tending towards is, can we loosen up the whole notion of functioning, and use other terms like well-being and so on, but also loosen up the notion so there's less an assumption that we know what good functioning is, and a bit more of a questioning and curiosity about what good functioning and good well-being might be for any individual, and particularly for neurodivergent individuals. But what that leads me back to also is this concept and language around executive functioning and executive dysfunction, because two things strike me about that. One is that it simply links what you've just been talking about. It's very strongly linked to the world of productivity and work and school and things like that. In other words, you're supposed to be able to and want to and be efficient at working or studying or whatever it is at this time, and then you can switch off, but you have to be on this time and off this time. And of course, the second thing that hits me about that is that it's back to the system and the capitalist system and the modern way society runs, and the norming and all those kind of the neuronormative expectations and so on, again, that we've been talking about. I find executive functioning and executive dysfunctioning quite suspect terms in a way. I don't think they're irrelevant or nonsense that we should throw them out around like that. Though I remember reading an article a couple of years ago by a very reputable psychologist, I can't remember their name, saying, to be honest, it's a pretty vague term. If you go and do a literature search around it and try and get a solid definition, you'll find it pretty hard, because it's a bit of a grab bag of this and that. What exactly is executive functioning? What exactly counts as executive dysfunction? He said, it's a bit of a smoke and mirrors in psychology, because it's not actually quite clear what we mean by it, or what we don't mean. But yeah, I also find it, and I don't find it useless or anything, and I do use it, but I also, I find it a little suspect from, again, that kind of societal capitalist point of view, of course, we as individuals need some executive functioning, if you want to use that term. We want to get our suitcase packed to go on holidays, but also there's also that element of who needs us to be functioning well in this executive way, this achieving tasks and productive and so on, so I think it's another interesting piece to stir, another interesting pot to stir to the top,
Well, that's massive, isn't it? Because
isn't it? It might be a whole separate one, really, another day, but
I mean, as I understand executive functioning to be like those kinds of, like, I think of it as like being in the executive, like being the pilot of the plane. We know where we want to go, but the pilot has to collate everything, all the instructions, and put them in the right order so that the plane starts off on the ground and ends up on the ground over there. And there's lots of things that have to be thought about and put in a different order and sequenced and all of the rest of it, So I sort of think of it like that. And I suppose if we're wanting for ourselves to achieve a goal or an outcome with several steps, and that's important to an individual person, then they might want to have that. But it's these expectations and these the stuff that gets thrown at people at work, so you must we'll give you all this volume of data, and then we'll just tap you on the shoulder when we're walking by and say, oh, can you just do this, and can you supply us with that, and don't forget the other. And you think that it starts to build up and build up. There's so much volume of data and tasks to think about, well, what order do I do the things in, and how am I going to get, what outcome am I supposed to, it can get very confusing, can't it?
Yeah. I mean, in a way, partly I think what this psychologist was saying was that there are just so many ways that can go wrong, that to call them all executive dysfunction doesn't tell us a lot. It just tells us, there's a million things that can get in the way of getting a task done, and because I think that that is one, that kind of sense of too many things, distraction, very bad, obviously, but also, just things mounting up before you're getting something else done. But, also for a lot of autistic people, a difficulty with that kind of, getting the task executed is that they're just busy getting another task executed. And I think that with ADHD as well, just hyper-focused into it, So in fact, they are working very efficiently and productively, but just at the one thing. And in fact, somebody else wants them to be doing something else, or they need to be doing something else. Maybe they need to back their case because they'll be leaving for the flight soon. In the meantime, they're knee deep in something else, So it's a paradoxical kind of notion, as I said, in that sense, It's like what are, all the different ways in which we can be just, not managing to execute the task that needs to be executed. Now, I like the sort of pilot metaphor, or the executive in business, or the obviously the various hierarchies of an army or whatever. That sense of the part of us that pulls things together is a good way of seeing it, I think. Yeah.
In transactional analysis, they call it adult in the executive, having the adult in executive, and that's sort of about all of the accessing all of your ego states, because they're all parts of you and they should all exist, but that they pass through the adult. So the adult gets to like as a filter to choose, rather than them just expressing yourself from those things in its raw state. That's one of the, that's like saying adult in the executive. That's one way of talking about that.
Interesting. Yeah, and one of the things that kind of reminds me of is, that it's kind of like there's a certain sense of that it's often associated with kind of capability,
functioning,
and therefore with the capability, ability, skill, or lack of skill. And I think particularly with autistic people, I've noticed that people both professionally and outside, in the world in general, seem to often assume that, issues that autistic people run up against, or that they run up against with an autistic person, an autistic pupil, or whatever they're dealing with, and specifically ones also that fall into the category of executive dysfunction, that they seem to be generally seem to be, or mostly seem to be, associated with lack of ability or lack of some kind of skill, social skill, or executive functioning skill, like keeping things in your memory, or estimating time well, or so on. But and that's absolutely relevant a lot of the time. But what I think is that quite a lot of the time, it's also, and this is the bit that one of the bits that makes me a bit suspicious sometimes. It's like quite a lot of the time also it can just be associated with motivation, by which I mean lack of motivation. As in, the reason the person isn't doing this efficiently and quickly is because they don't have any interest, not because they're not capable,
or something else has caught their attention, or actually there's other things going on, that the person has more to them than their functioning levels or activities, don't they? That we have an inner world as well,
But I mean, like I think school is a classic example. It's like somebody might not be, unable to write an essay. They might just have zero interest in writing an essay. quite a lot of interest in reading the very quite complex books that they're currently reading. They might have lots of, ability to understand language and maybe even the ability to write down good language, but they just cannot muster the motivation to write this essay on this topic that you've given them that they have no interest in. And that frankly, the person who's given them the topic has no interest in. It's just on the list of essay topics. And I think the reason I'm mentioning that in this context is I think that is a bigger issue for autistic people, and I think for people with ADHD as well, like motivation and interest base and monotropism and all those things. It's harder. That's why you get that spiky profile in school and college. It's like it's harder to do something if you're not interested in it, and it's much easier if you are. In general, but way more so for an autistic person. So they, and again, that sometimes just gets lumped into executive functioning difficulties, but then the whole question of motivation gets lost. It's an issue that interests me in itself, the motivational one. But yeah, so there's loads of, I think, themes, that just kind of pulled out there. Yeah,
good teachers and trainers ideally will spot that somebody is not lit up by the task or by the lesson, and they have got the interest themselves to make it interesting, and to it's like they have a relationship with their learners and they care about that. Yes. And they want to convey stuff that does ignite interest or cause a spark, or they try and meet the person halfway rather than just expecting that I'm just going to deliver this stuff and that person's going to have to do things.
Yeah, well, like saying, is there a similar topic that you'd like to write an essay about rather than that one, and saying, well, yeah, that one will do just as well. Yeah, do that one. I mean, it's the principle that things like, or one of the principles that things like Montessori education or Steiner schools work on is do what you're motivated to do a lot of the time. I mean, every now and then you have to do things you're not quite so motivated to do, but a lot of the time, follow the interest, As the interest will indicate in one way where the gaps are, and it will also give you the energy to do the task, whatever it might be, So I think, I just think that's an interesting area, again, connected with everything in a way, but also connected with this whole notion of functioning. Somebody's not functioning well because they're not doing a task that someone else has set them. Do you know what I mean?
And then they start to believe those things about themselves instead. Yeah. Whereas self-expression, finding something in yourself and then being able to express yourself about it, whether that's write an essay or do whatever, that's it's different beliefs about self then, isn't it?
That's an interesting point maybe to finish on, and maybe one again that we could talk a bit about another time is self-efficacy beliefs and internalized, kind of learned helplessness and self-limiting beliefs. That's a big piece in itself, isn't it? It brings me back actually to what can we hope for ourselves and for autistic people, or it's to be settled for, well, if it could just be made a bit better, folks, and we could be just functioning a bit better, or is there, not just as individuals but as a community, could we self-limit ourselves rather than thinking, no, actually.
Yeah, and it's in law, isn't it, to address workplaces, to make reasonable adjustments. Well, you can be thinking about that for yourself, can't you? What reasonable adjustments do I need for myself in my own life, even my morning routine or anything? Not just workplace. It's not just a workplace. Relevant, it's getting life on your terms, not in a selfish or demanding way, but in a way that suits, in a way that work brings out the best in you, the way that is natural, the way that you can function, if you like, or be the way you can be and live. The
way that meets important needs. I think that's the core phrase, really, and I suppose maybe that is a good piece to end on, is that in the end of it all, functioning or well-being or any of those things, ultimately depend on meeting core needs. There are needs that are a little more optional, but there's other needs that are not. And if those needs aren't being properly met, well, then why would you be functioning well or have well-being? And that's another theme. Maybe needs is another hook we could hang a podcast episode on.
Yeah, sounds good.
Great, thanks for that. Always interesting.
Yeah.
Lots of stuff there to to keep thinking about.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, better head.
Yeah. Okay.
Good to see you. Take
Yeah.
care.
You too. See you
Bye-bye.
next time. Bye.